There is something you carry with you every moment of your existence. Something so familiar that you've forgotten it's there, like the air you breathe or the weight of your own skeleton. It moves when you move, thinks when you think, speaks when you speak. It is the silent architect of every decision you make, every fear you harbor, every dream you abandon before it has a chance to bloom. And here's the peculiar thing. This invisible companion, this constant presence that colors everything you experience, is not something imposed upon you from the outside. It is not money, though money certainly plays its games with your peace of mind. It is not other people, though they too can complicate the simple business of being alive. No. What you must let go of to be free is far more intimate, far more insidious, and paradoxically, far more optional than you've ever imagined. It is the story you tell about who you are. Before we go any further into this mystery together, I want to invite you to join this exploration more deeply. If what we're uncovering here resonates with something true in your experience, consider subscribing to this journey, leaving a trace of your presence with a like, and sharing in the comments what arises in you as we walk this path together. Not as obligation, but as participation in something that matters, something that speaks to the question of how we might actually live before we die. Now think for a moment about the last time someone asked you to describe yourself. What did you reach for? Your profession, perhaps? Your relationships? Your accomplishments? Your struggles? Notice how quickly the mind assembles this portfolio of identity, this collection of facts and narratives that supposedly add up to you. I am a teacher, a parent, a survivor of this or that difficulty. I am successful, or I am struggling. I am confident, or I am anxious. I am the person who always does this, who never does that. And with each sentence, each label, each story, you are building a cage so subtle that you mistake it for shelter. The truly fascinating thing about this cage is that it feels so necessary. After all, how would you navigate the world without knowing who you are? How would you make decisions, form relationships, set boundaries, or pursue goals if you didn't have some stable sense of self to reference? This is the trap's genius. It presents itself as essential infrastructure, as the very foundation upon which a human life must be built. And so you defend it. You defend your story with the same ferocity that an animal defends its territory, because somewhere deep in the architecture of your being, you've come to believe that if the story falls apart, you fall apart. But here's what actually happens when you begin to loosen your grip on the narrative of self. Nothing falls apart. Or rather, what falls apart was never actually you to begin with. It was scaffolding mistaken for the building, map mistaken for territory, menu mistaken for meal. The real you, if we can even use such a word, is what remains when the story stops running, when the internal narrator takes a breath, when the constant project of self-construction pauses for even a moment. And in that pause, something extraordinary becomes available. Not freedom from the world, but freedom within it. Not escape from experience, but the full taste of it, undiluted by the commentary track of identity. Consider how exhausting it is to maintain yourself. Not your body, which requires food and sleep and movement, but the idea of yourself, which requires constant curation, perpetual defense, endless revision. You wake up each morning and immediately begin the work of being you. You check the story to make sure it's still intact. Am I still the capable one? Am I still struggling with this particular thing? Am I living up to my own standards, meeting my own expectations, staying consistent with my established character? The mind scans the environment for threats to the narrative, for evidence that might contradict the official version of who you are. And when such evidence appears, when life dares to present you with an experience that doesn't fit your story, you have two options: deny the experience or revise the story. Both are forms of violence against reality. This violence is so normalized that we don't even recognize it as violence. We call it having standards, maintaining boundaries, knowing ourselves. But watch closely what happens in the moment when reality and story collide. Someone sees you in a way that contradicts your self-image, and immediately there's a contraction, defensiveness, the urgent need to correct their perception. You do something that surprises even you, something that doesn't fit the established pattern, and the mind rushes in to explain it away, to smooth over the inconsistency, to restore the familiar narrative. The story demands coherence, even when experience is wild and contradictory and beautifully chaotic. And nowhere is this more evident than in our relationship with freedom itself. We say we want to be free, but what we usually mean is that we want the freedom to be ourselves more fully, to express our true nature without constraint, to live according to our deepest values. Can you see the trap embedded in that desire? It presupposes that there's a fixed self to be free, a true nature to express, a set of deepest values already written into your essential being. It makes freedom another project of self-actualization, another item on the list of things this character you call yourself must achieve. But real freedom, the kind that actually liberates rather than just rearranging the furniture in the prison, cannot coexist with a rigid sense of self, because the self, as you've constructed it, is the prison. This doesn't mean you become nobody, some kind of blank slate wandering through life without preferences or personality. That's just another story, the story of the enlightened being who has transcended self. What actually happens is far more ordinary and far more radical. You continue to have preferences, to make choices, to show up in the world with particular qualities and tendencies, but these are no longer defended as who you are. They're simply what's arising. They're the weather, not your identity. And when the weather changes, when you find yourself being someone different than yesterday's version, there's no crisis, no need for explanation. The story loosens its grip and experience becomes fluid again. Think about children before they fully construct the prison of self. They are one person in one moment, a completely different person in the next. They are brave, then terrified, generous, then selfish, confident, then uncertain, all in the space of an afternoon. And they don't see this as inconsistency requiring management. They are simply being, moment to moment, response to response, without the heavy editing hand of narrative identity telling them what fits and what doesn't. This is not because they're undeveloped, but because they haven't yet been fully colonized by story. They haven't yet accepted the fundamental lie that freedom comes from being more fully yourself, rather than from letting go of the project of being anyone at all. So what would it mean to live without defending your story? Not to abandon responsibility or become chaotic, but to stop needing your experience to confirm a particular narrative about who you are. What would it mean to wake up in the morning without immediately resuming the broadcast of self, without checking to make sure you're still the person you were yesterday, still on track with the life you're supposed to be living? What would it mean to meet another human being without the filter of story, without immediately positioning yourself in relation to them as superior or inferior, similar or different, safe or threatening? What would it mean to face a challenge without needing it to prove something about your strength or reveal something about your weakness? The mind recoils from these questions because they threaten the fundamental project that has consumed most of your conscious life, the project of becoming someone, of making something of yourself, of crafting a life that means something. But notice that the mind's recoil is just another movement of the story, another way the narrative protects itself from examination. The question is not whether you can live without story, which is almost certainly impossible for most of us most of the time. The question is whether you can live with the story held lightly, worn like a coat that can be taken off rather than skin that cannot be removed. The question is whether you can taste even for a moment the freedom that exists prior to all identity, beneath all narrative, in the simple, naked fact of being alive right now.
There's a peculiar kind of suffering that belongs uniquely to human beings, a suffering that no other creature endures with quite our particular flavor of anguish. It's not the suffering of physical pain, though we certainly experience that. It's not the suffering of loss or danger, though these too are part of our inheritance as mortal creatures. No, the suffering I'm speaking of is the suffering of being someone, of carrying the weight of a self through time, of needing your life to add up to something coherent and meaningful while simultaneously watching it unfold in ways that often contradict whatever meaning you've tried to impose. This is the suffering that keeps you awake at 3 in the morning, rehearsing conversations that haven't happened yet, defending yourself against accusations that haven't been made, trying to solve the unsolvable problem of being you. And here's what makes this suffering so pernicious. It masquerades as the solution. The mind says, if only you could get your story right, if only you could become the person you're meant to be, if only you could heal your wounds and overcome your limitations and finally arrive at the destination of complete self-actualization, then you would be free. And so you enter the endless cycle of self-improvement, spiritual seeking, therapeutic excavation, all in service of the fantasy that there is a version of you that doesn't suffer from being you. But this is like trying to dig your way out of a hole. The more effort you put in, the deeper you go. Because the tool you're using, the one doing all the digging, is the very thing that needs to be set down. Consider your memories, not the memories themselves, which are simply traces of experience stored in the body and brain, but what you make of them, how you weave them into narrative, assign them meaning, use them as evidence for conclusions about who you are. That difficult childhood becomes the story of why you struggle with intimacy. That moment of triumph becomes proof of your capability, a touchstone you return to when doubt arises. That betrayal becomes the foundation of your distrust. That loss becomes the reason you hold back from fully living. Memory, which is simply the past continuing to exist in present awareness, gets conscripted into the project of self-definition. And in the process, the actual experience, the raw taste of what happened, gets overlaid with interpretation until you can no longer distinguish between what occurred and what it supposedly means about you. This is how the past becomes a prison. Not because bad things happened, though they may have, not because you carry trauma, though you might, but because you've turned events into evidence, experience into explanation. You've made yourself a defendant in a trial that never ends, constantly presenting exhibits that prove your case. This is who I am, this is why I am this way, this is what I can and cannot do, and the judge and jury are also you, which means the verdict is always already decided, endlessly confirmed by selective attention to whatever supports the established narrative. But watch what happens when you encounter something that doesn't fit. When you act with sudden courage despite the story that says you're timid, when you feel generous despite the narrative that insists you're selfish, when you create something beautiful despite the belief that you lack talent. The experience doesn't update the story dismisses the experience. It was a fluke, an anomaly, not representative of who you really are, and so the cage stays intact, defended against reality itself. What would happen if you let memory be memory without making it mean something about you? If you allowed the past to exist without using it to explain the present? This doesn't mean denying what happened or pretending difficult experiences didn't leave their mark. It means distinguishing between the fact of experience and the interpretation that turns facts into identity. It means recognizing that you are not your history, you are the space in which history appears. And in that space, in that vast openness that is your actual nature, anything can arise without threatening your existence because there is no fixed you to be threatened. The mind, of course, finds this terrifying because the mind is in the business of meaning-making, of pattern recognition, of creating coherence out of chaos, and there is no greater chaos than a life lived without the organizing principle of a central character. Without the story of who you are, how would you know what to do? How would you make sense of your choices? How would you maintain any continuity of purpose or direction? These are legitimate questions, but they're based on a misunderstanding of what happens when story loosens its grip. You don't become random or directionless. You become responsive rather than reactive. You act from presence rather than from position. You meet each moment fresh rather than through the filter of what yesterday's version of you decided should happen. There's a beautiful paradox here. When you stop being someone, you become capable of authentic response. When you let go of the need to be consistent with your self-image, you become genuinely spontaneous. When you cease defending your story, you become actually available to life as it is, rather than as you need it to be to confirm who you think you are. This is not chaos. This is clarity. This is what freedom actually feels like when it's not contaminated by the project of self-improvement. And yes, people will find this disorienting. They're used to your predictability, your stable character, the reliable patterns that allow them to know how to be with you. When you stop performing your assigned role with such dedication, when you refuse to stay consistent with their image of you, there will be confusion and sometimes conflict. But notice what you're actually being asked to do in such moments: to betray presence for the sake of story, to sacrifice truth for the comfort of continuity. You're being asked to keep the prison intact so that others don't have to question their own. This is where the path gets lonely in a particular way. Not lonely because you're isolated, but lonely because you're no longer seeking validation for who you are. You're no longer looking for others to confirm the story, to see you as you need to be seen, to reflect back the self-image you're trying to maintain. And when that need drops away, something shifts in your relationships. They become less about mutual story maintenance and more about genuine encounter. Less about using each other to feel real, and more about meeting in what's actually real. Some relationships survive this shift, many don't, and there's grief in that, but it's honest grief rather than the slow suffocation of pretending. The thing you must let go of to be free is not your job or your possessions or your commitments. It's not even your relationships, though they may transform. What you must let go of is the inner tyrant that demands you be someone, that insists your life makes sense, that requires your experience to confirm a particular narrative. You must let go of the judge who constantly evaluates whether you're living up to your own standards. You must let go of the editor who cuts and shapes experience to fit the established plot. You must let go of the defender who stands guard at the gates of identity, screening out anything that threatens the official story. And in the letting go, which is not something you do once but a returning again and again to openness, you discover that you are already free. Not free from the circumstances of your life, which continue to be whatever they are. Not free from feeling or wanting or caring, which are the very texture of being alive, but free from the tyranny of needing to be anyone at all. Free from the exhausting project of self-construction. Free to be what you actually are before the story begins, after the story ends, in the space between thoughts where the narrator takes a breath and presence simply is.
Let me tell you about the moment when the story cracks. It's not usually dramatic. There's no blinding light, no sudden revelation that changes everything forever. It's more like a subtle shift in perspective, a momentary loosening of the grip, a brief glimpse of what lies on the other side of the narrative you've been defending your whole life. And the curious thing is, you've probably experienced this many times without recognizing it for what it was. It happens in moments of complete absorption, when you're so engaged in an activity that you forget to be someone doing it, when you're listening so completely that there's no listener, only listening, when you're looking at something so beautiful that the boundary between seer and seen dissolves.
In these moments, the story stops running. The internal narrator falls silent, and there you are, not as someone having an experience, but as experience itself, unmediated by interpretation, undiluted by the need to fit into a narrative framework. These moments are more common than you think. They happen whenever you laugh so hard that you forget your problems, whenever you're so moved by music that your carefully constructed self temporarily dissolves, whenever you're completely present with another person, when the usual social positioning stops and genuine meeting occurs. Whenever you're faced with something so vast, so overwhelming, that the small story of who you are becomes irrelevant. The ocean at night, the death of someone you love, the birth of a child, the sudden recognition of your own mortality. What these moments reveal is not that you need to have more peak experiences or pursue altered states. What they reveal is that the self you think you need to protect and perfect and present to the world is optional. It's a habit, not a necessity. It's a strategy that once served you, perhaps even saved you, but that now functions more like armor you no longer need but have forgotten how to remove. And the weight of it, the constant burden of maintaining and defending this armor, is what you mistake for the normal condition of being human. But here's what the mind does with these moments of freedom. It turns them into memories, and then it turns those memories into more evidence for the story. It says, I am the kind of person who has profound experiences. Or, I am the kind of person who used to have profound experiences but lost the capacity. Or, I need to have more of these experiences to finally arrive at the freedom I seek. And just like that, even the glimpses beyond story get woven back into narrative, become part of the project of becoming someone who is free, rather than recognizing that you are already free when the project stops. The question then becomes not how to have more moments of freedom, but how to recognize that freedom is always already here, beneath and prior to and during the story, never actually lost, only obscured by the constant activity of self-maintenance. This recognition doesn't require altered states or special practices, though those might serve as helpful pointers. It requires only a willingness to look at what's actually happening when the story is running, to see the mechanism of self-construction with clarity rather than continuing to be hypnotized by it. So look now, in this very moment, what is actually here before the story begins to interpret it. There is awareness, yes. There is sensation, thought, perception. There is the raw fact of being alive, of presence occurring, of experience unfolding. And then, almost instantaneously, the narrative voice begins its work. This is good or bad. This fits or doesn't fit. This confirms or threatens who I am. But in the space before that voice begins, in the gap between pure experience and the interpretation of experience, what do you find? Not emptiness, not nothing, but a kind of open clarity, a spaciousness that is your actual nature, upon which all experience appears and disappears like weather moving through sky. This spaciousness, this open awareness that you are prior to any story about who you are, cannot be threatened by experience. It cannot be diminished by failure or enhanced by success. It simply is, unchanging in its essential nature, even as everything within it constantly changes. And when you recognize this, even for a moment, the desperate project of self-improvement reveals itself as unnecessary. Not because there's nothing to improve in your circumstances or capacities, but because the you that was supposedly in need of improvement turns out to be a fiction, a useful fiction perhaps, but optional nonetheless. What then? What happens when the story is seen through, when the narrator is recognized as just another voice arising in awareness rather than the central authority that must be obeyed? Do you become passive without motivation or direction? Do you stop caring about anything? Does life become meaningless? These are the fears that keep the story intact, the anxieties that prevent investigation of what lies beyond the familiar prison of self. but they're based on a misunderstanding. They assume that without the story, there's nothing, that without the constructed self, there's no one home. But what you actually discover is the opposite. There's more life without the story, not less. More capacity for authentic response, more space for genuine feeling, more availability for real relationship. Without the story demanding that experience conform to expectation, you become capable of surprise. Without the need to maintain consistency, you become fluid, responsive to what each moment actually requires rather than what yesterday's version of you decided should happen. Without the constant project of self-improvement, you become free to engage with circumstances as they are, rather than as they need to be for you to feel like you're making progress. This is not spiritual bypassing, not pretending that difficult things aren't difficult. It's meeting difficulty without the additional layer of suffering that comes from needing it to mean something about who you are. And relationships transform in this space. When you're no longer using others to confirm your story, when you're no longer positioning yourself in relation to them as superior or inferior, similar or different, you become capable of actual meeting, not the performance of intimacy, where you play assigned roles and maintain careful scripts, but genuine encounter, where two human beings are present with each other without the mediation of story. This is rare. This is precious. This is what most people mean when they talk about feeling truly seen or deeply understood. Not that someone has accurately assessed your character, but that they've met you in the space prior to character, in the openness that exists before a story begins. The one thing you must let go of to be free, then, is the conviction that you need to be someone. Not the practical reality of having a name and a role and responsibilities in the world, but the deep attachment to a fixed identity, the belief that you are your story, the demand that experience conform your narrative. This letting go is not a single act, but a continuous returning, a practice of noticing when the story tightens its grip and choosing again to relax into the spaciousness that you actually are. And here's the paradox that might only make sense in living it. When you let go of being someone, you become more authentically yourself than you've ever been. Not the self you've constructed through effort and defense, but the self that naturally expresses when all the construction stops. More spontaneous, more responsive, more alive. Not because you've improved yourself or finally gotten your story right, but because you've stopped interfering with what you actually are beneath all the story. This is what freedom tastes like. Not the freedom to be who you want to be, which is just more imprisonment and aspiration, but the freedom from being anyone at all, which paradoxically allows your genuine nature to express without the constant editing hand of narrative identity. It's available now. It's always been available, not as something to achieve, but as something to recognize, like suddenly seeing the spaces between objects rather than only the objects themselves, like becoming aware of silence rather than only sound. So the invitation, if you're willing to accept it, is not to work harder at being yourself or to finally solve the problem of who you are. The invitation is to notice the story when it's running, to see the mechanism of self-construction with gentle clarity, and to discover what remains when the story stops. Not once and for all, which is just another story, but again and again, in this moment and this one, returning to the freedom that was never actually lost, only forgotten in the noise of narrative. This is what you must let go of to be free, the belief that you are your story, rather than the vast awareness in which all stories appear and disappear. And in that letting go, which happens not through force but through understanding, you discover that you were never actually bound. The cage was always made of thought, and thought cannot contain what you actually are.